Feeling too much is not a choice, nor is it a flaw. It's a way of being in the world that doesn't fit within the usual structures of modern life. While most people move through their days with functional lightness, there are those who carry a denser gaze, a perception that goes beyond the surface. It's not just about emotion, it's about an expanded awareness that picks up on hidden details, emotional nuances, subtle contradictions. This way of existing can't simply be turned off like a switch. It's always there, active, absorbing everything: words, tone of voice, environments, silences, other people's pain. And the result of that, often, is exhaustion. In Jungian psychology, this kind of sensitivity is directly linked to the psychic functions of the introverted intuitive type. These are people who don't just observe what's in front of their eyes, they sense what lies behind it. They are guided by symbols, hidden meanings, impressions that emerge from the unconscious. That's why everyday life, with its predictability and superficiality, often feels like an artificial play in which they don't belong. Life demands they adapt to a rhythm that doesn't match their nature. And this constant friction between what they feel and what is expected creates a sense of disconnection that's hard to explain. Philosophically, this experience recalls the concept of authentic existence in Kierkegaard and Heidegger. To live authentically is to carry the burden of facing the depth of being, even when it hurts, without any guarantee of belonging. For Jung, this path is necessary for individuation, that is, to become who you truly are in essence, rather than a mask adapted to your surroundings. This process of becoming whole can be painful, especially in a world that is still asleep. It's a kind of fatigue that doesn't come from tasks, but from the intensity with which everything is experienced. The mundane routine, for these individuals, demands more energy than most would imagine. A social encounter can be exhausting. A hostile environment, even without aggressive words, can trigger deep anguish. The mind won't go quiet. The body won't relax. And what others call too much sensitivity is, in truth, the natural consequence of living with an open psyche, one that's permeable and exposed to everything the world prefers to ignore. The pain of feeling too much cannot be fixed with shallow advice or ready-made phrases. It's essential to recognize that there are different kinds of consciousness, and some inevitably carry the weight of depth. What many see as exaggeration is, in fact, your genuine way of being. And when that consciousness is denied, silenced, or ridiculed, it doesn't disappear. It turns against you, transforming what should be a gift into suffering. That's why the first step isn't to change who you are, but to understand what that means. This emotional intensity is the beginning of a rare clarity in a world that runs on autopilot. And this path, though difficult, is also one of the most truthful anyone can walk. Being misunderstood isn't just a matter of language, it's a wound. One that doesn't bleed, but corrodes. For those who live with an inward gaze, for those who feel the world with extra layers, being understood becomes as vital as air. Because speaking, for these people, isn't about spilling words, it's about undressing the soul. It's an attempt to translate into sentences what's barely organized within. And when that isn't received, when the other responds with haste or judgment, it's not just the conversation that breaks. It's the hope of existing without disguise. Carl Rogers, founder of humanistic psychology, said that true listening is rare, and that being genuinely heard has an almost miraculous effect on the psyche. To him, one of humanity's deepest pains is living in a world where our real self must be hidden in order to be accepted. And when someone who feels deeply tries to show themselves and is met with coldness or impatience, a subtle trauma is born, the trauma of not being embraced in their essence. The result is a constant attempt to recalibrate one's expression. You begin to hide parts of yourself. You soften your words. You think 2, 3, 4 times before saying what's really on your mind. Not because you want to lie, but because you want to survive. Because at some point you learned that revealing your truth is frightening. That the silence that follows your honesty can hurt more than the loneliness of keeping quiet. But what no one tells you is that the pain of being ignored only grows over time. Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist and philosopher, observed that human beings don't suffer just from pain itself, but from the emptiness of meaning that pain can carry. And when you speak and are not heard, what gets hollowed out is the very meaning of communication, connection, sharing. Your words stop being a bridge and become a wall, and that starts to harden your chest, swallow your words, and suffocate your feelings. However, this pain must not be suffocated. It needs to be understood at its root. It's not about feeling too much, but about living with intensity and presence. You are not difficult. You simply require presence, something many people don't know how to offer. And as painful as it may be, this should not lead you to silence yourself. Because every time you hide what you feel to avoid bothering others, something inside you shuts down. And over time, that inner disconnection becomes a prison. The healing doesn't come from speaking to just anyone, but from finding a space where your words are heard with the soul. Jung said that true listening is the kind that perceives even what hasn't been said. That is the kind of listening that sets you free, that soothes, that allows pain to take shape and that shape to find rest. Until that space appears, staying true to your own truth is already, in itself, an act of resistance. Living in a world that celebrates the superficial while marginalizing depth is one of the most dehumanizing experiences for those who feel intensely. In a reality where everything must be light, fast, sellable, pleasant, depth becomes an obstacle. There is no space for silence, nuance, or reflection. Relationships are instant, conversations are shallow, emotions are streamlined like commodities. Life has become a storefront, and those who carry a dense soul often feel like they don't belong in the catalog. Contemporary society mass-produces a kind of accelerated subjectivity. From an early age, we learn to hide what we feel, to ignore difficult questions, to suppress discomfort. And so we start molding ourselves to fit, in conversations that bore us, in relationships that drain us, in routines that make us sick. But that kind of adaptation comes at a high price. Jung warned that the cost of not living in alignment with your essence is psychic fragmentation. Little by little, a person turns into a collection of roles. The one that pleases, the one that is accepted, the one that appears normal. But behind that appearance, a difficult-to-name emptiness begins to grow. That emptiness is the reflection of a soul left unused. When you're forced to live on the surface while holding an ocean within you, everything starts to lose its meaning. Everyday conversations sound repetitive. Celebrations feel rehearsed. Bonds become too fragile to hold anything real. You try to engage, to smile, to go with the flow. But inside, there's a constant discomfort, like watching everything from the outside, unable to truly take part. Existential philosophy addresses this experience as the condition of the stranger. Albert Camus described this feeling as a painful clarity, the awareness that the world around you is asleep in its own automatisms, while you remain too awake, too conscious, too alone. And that clarity is not arrogance, nor rejection of others. It's simply the realization that the life lived by most seems to lack truth. In a culture where entertainment is valued more than introspection, and where being interesting matters more than being authentic, depth becomes viewed as a problem. People want quick answers, ready-made advice, easy emotions. There's no time to process what's felt, nor willingness to listen to those who think outside the box. That's why people with depth start to feel like they need to edit themselves, to reduce their complexity, to fake lightness. But every one of these concessions leaves behind invisible scars. The pain isn't just in not being understood, it's in having to hide who you really are just to continue being accepted. And this constant conflict between essence and adaptation slowly drains the soul's vitality. Carl Jung affirmed that the process of individuation requires the courage to break away from these masks and return to your inner truth. Until that happens, living in a shallow world becomes a real burden. It's the weight of being whole in a reality that only accepts fragments. There's a kind of fatigue that can't be cured with rest. You can sleep 8 hours, take a vacation, slow down, and still wake up with a heavy body, a foggy mind, a tight chest. That fatigue doesn't come from routine, but from the misalignment between what you feel and what you live. It accumulates in swallowed silences, in emotions held back, in thoughts that never find space to breathe. It's the result of bearing, every single day, the weight of not being able to fully be who you are. Psychosomatic psychology has long shown that unexpressed emotions tend to lodge themselves in the body. Chronic muscle tension, persistent fatigue, unexplained aches, insomnia, and even autoimmune diseases are among the most common signs of a mind living in constant emotional repression. Carl Jung had already intuited this before science formally established it. For him, the body is a language of the unconscious. When the soul is silenced, the body screams. And that scream is not always heard. Often, it is medicated, rationalized, ignored. But it remains there, throbbing on the inside, like a silent cry for help. It's not laziness. It's not weakness. It's emotional overload. You absorb the atmosphere, the tension, the unspoken words. You carry in your chest the pain of others, the anguish of the world, your own internal chaos, all without rest. And all of this adds to the pressure of having to function normally, to smile in social interactions, to produce, engage, deliver. Every day you force yourself to appear light while you're falling apart, something inside you becomes disorganized. It's like wearing armor that protects on the outside but suffocates on the inside. Philosophically, this is the point where existence becomes unbearable. Heidegger called this state the fall, a kind of detachment from one's own being, in which a person lives automatically, alienated from their essence, guided by conventions they never chose. The deep soul, in trying to adjust to this automatism, begins to collapse. It feels as though it's drifting away from something sacred, essential, true, and that distance manifests as a diffuse unease, a lingering anxiety, a constant feeling of being in the wrong place, even when everything seems right on the surface. This prolonged state leads to a loss of vitality. Things that once moved you no longer make sense. Art loses its color, music its effect, encounters fail to fulfill. You begin to empty out without realizing it, because you live in a culture that doesn't recognize the symptoms of the soul. And when you try to explain this exhaustion, you often hear, "You just need to relax, it'll pass, you think too much." But it doesn't pass, because it's not just physical tiredness but a deeper kind of disconnection. Reconnecting doesn't mean running from reality. It means stopping the flight from yourself. It's about returning to feel with legitimacy, naming what weighs on you, allowing the body to speak without censorship. Jung believed that you have to descend into the depths to find the true self, and sometimes what we call exhaustion is merely an invitation to dive inward, so that instead of merely surviving on minimal energy, you can live in wholeness, even if that means facing truths the world insists on ignoring. Little by little, you begin to notice. Every time you show your full self, something breaks. Conversations shift in tone. People pull away. The room grows colder. You start hearing that you're too intense, too sensitive, hard to deal with. And before long, almost without realizing it, you begin to hide parts of yourself, to withhold thoughts, to modulate your energy, to dilute your own depth, just to avoid being a burden. This movement, though subtle, is devastating, because every time you stop being who you are to be accepted, you drift further from yourself. Donald Winnicott, the English psychoanalyst, called this the false self, a structure built to secure belonging in environments that don't tolerate authenticity. The problem is, over time, the false self replaces the real one. You learn to survive, but forget what it means to truly live. You're accepted, but not loved. Tolerated, but not seen. Functional, but deeply alone. In Jungian psychology, this process is one of the most painful forms of shadow repression. The shadow is not just what is bad or dark. It is everything that has been excluded from our conscious awareness because it wasn't accepted by others or by ourselves. And when you start hiding your depth to avoid rejection, you're casting away a deeply valuable part of your being. Your sensitivity, your intuition, your creative power. You start living in fragments, one part for the world, another forgotten in silence. This kind of fragmentation has real consequences, not just emotional, but also spiritual and existential. Nietzsche said that becoming who you are requires courage, because it involves breaking away from the need to please. But how can one have that courage in a world where difference is seen as a threat? How can you hold on to your truth when even those closest to you react with discomfort or sarcasm? It's at this crossroads that many people become lost. Upon realizing that their depth unsettles others, the fear of rejection starts to speak louder. And when fear takes the reins, it begins to shape your character. You start calculating your words, avoiding topics you love, limiting yourself in the name of acceptance. And with that, life becomes small, narrow, colorless, because there is no joy to be found when you have to shrink yourself just to fit in. This vicious cycle must be broken. And the way out is not some proud self-sufficiency that rejects others, but an internal strength that allows you to keep being who you are, even if it costs you certain relationship. Jung believed that healing is only possible where there is integration. And to integrate means to bring into the light everything that has been denied, to look with compassion at what was cast aside, and to firmly uphold your own wholeness, even if it makes others uncomfortable. Being whole will never be easy in a world that rewards the superficial. But that's exactly why your depth is necessary. It's not exaggeration. It's not a flaw. It's truth. And truth, no matter how much it costs, is the only ground where the soul can truly rest. What you seek isn't an audience, nor admiration, nor excessive attention. What you truly desire is something much simpler, and, paradoxically, rare, to be truly seen. Not in the superficial sense of being looked at, but in the deeper sense of being met. You want to be recognized in your essence, by someone who doesn't just hear your words, but understands what lies beyond them. Someone who, when hearing you speak about what moves you, doesn't try to fix, minimize, or change you, but simply stays present, whole, offering real listening and true care. This need is not vanity. It's humanity. Martin Buber, the philosopher of encounter, said that existence is only fully realized in the space between the I and the thou. We are not complete alone. We are beings who bloom through mutual recognition, and when that recognition doesn't happen, the soul becomes ill. It shuts down, withdraws, becomes defensive, not out of weakness but out of survival, because the absence of empathetic listening turns the experience of being into a constant struggle to justify oneself, and that's far too exhausting for someone who feels everything so deeply. Jungian psychology also leads us to this place. He believed that a true encounter with the other is a path to mutual transformation. But for that to happen, there must be space for otherness. And the problem is that in a world ruled by utilitarian relationships and emotional haste, there is rarely a willingness to hold the weight of another's depth. The bond, then, becomes fragile. and you can feel it in the air, when someone is merely waiting for their turn to speak, not truly with you in the same feeling. That's why conversations frustrate you, why connections leave you hungry. It's not ingratitude, it's that your soul craves more, not in quantity but in quality. You don't want to be surrounded by voices. You want a shared silence that doesn't suffocate, a gaze that welcomes without judgment, an affection that doesn't demand lightness when all you have to offer is truth. Levinas, another philosopher of otherness, wrote that the face of the other calls us to ethical responsibility. To be seen, in that sense, is to be welcomed in our vulnerability without being dissolved by it. And maybe this is your greatest longing, not idealized love, but real acceptance, the experience of being able to exist in the presence of someone without hiding your crack, without needing to explain why you are the way you are. And as rare as that experience may seem, it exists. But for it to happen, you must keep your truth alive. Keep offering the world your depth, even when it isn't immediately understood. Because somewhere, someone else feels too much as well. Someone is waiting for a presence like yours to finally let their guard down. Being seen heals. Being understood transforms. And your search, as lonely as it may feel, is proof that your soul has not given up on being whole. Depth wounds, but it also reveals. It carries a contradiction. It pushes people away, yet it connects in the truest way. That's why what seemed like a curse from the beginning, this intense, silent, often lonely way of feeling the world, can, over time, become a key. A key that doesn't open external doors, but internal ones. And it's only through that inner opening that it becomes possible to live in fullness, even when the world insists on fragmenting everything. Jung said that the process of individuation involves ruptures, internal conflicts, confrontations with the shadow, deep revisions of one's story. What you feel today, that weight in your chest, isn't meaningless suffering. It's the friction between your essence and a world that constantly demands adaptation. And that friction is the starting point for transformation. What you need to understand is that your pain doesn't separate you, it reveals you. It's not a sign of weakness, but of unsuppressed sensitivity. In a world where most people live disconnected from themselves, to feel is an act of resistance. And the more you feel, the more you are called to find your own path, one that won't look like anyone else's. A path where depth doesn't need to be hidden, but integrated, embraced, recognized as a vital part of who you are. Nietzsche said that he who has a why can bear almost anyhow. And perhaps your why lies exactly in what now feels unbearable, your intensity, your clarity, your pain. The same depth that isolates you may be what enables you to understand others in a way no one else can. Your pain, when understood and worked through, can become wisdom. It can become a bridge. It can become healing. But for that to happen, you must stop trying to fit where your soul contracts. You must stop asking for permission to exist fully. The search for belonging cannot come at the cost of your integrity. The world may continue to be shallow, and it will. But that doesn't diminish the value of those who dive deep. On the contrary, perhaps it's the ones who dive who carry within them the maps the rest of the world doesn't even know it lost. To be deep in a superficial world is, above all, a call to courage. The courage not to mold yourself, not to erase yourself, to keep being whole even when it makes others uncomfortable. The courage to find meaning not in approval, but in presence, and to make your own consciousness the place where, at last, you can rest without mask. In the end, your depth is not what separates you from the world. It's what the world needs most, even if it doesn't realize it. And it's in that silent space between pain and clarity that true freedom is born. The freedom to be who you are, without fear, without excuses, without needing to apologize for feeling so much.